Hello, everyone, and welcome once again to Reading Culture. Today we are going to be looking at a short poem by the British poet W.H. Auden entitled The Shield of Achilles. And this is really going to be a return, in some ways, to uh, some of the themes that we talked about in earlier videos. You may recall one of the first videos for this channel and this video series that uh, we had was a video on what is a hero. We looked at some of the various definitions of what a hero is. And you may recall, right, that the origins of the word hero in English come from ancient Greek, and that originally it had no moral or ethical meaning, right? It didn't have any kind of associations with, um, doing something that one ought to necessarily approve of, but rather a hero was someone gifted with kind of supernatural strength and ability, usually favored by the gods, right? So again, a kind of ancient Greek figure like Achilles is very much in that kind of definition. And it is from this tradition that Auden draws for his poem. So W.H. Auden is one of the more significant poets, modern poets of the 20th century. Right? He lived from 1907 to 1973 and wrote quite prolifically. Um, it's perhaps worth noting that one of his more famous poems is entitled "The Age of Anxiety," which is a title which is often used by historians to refer to the post-World War II period, the kind of Cold War period. Right, this age of anxiety because of the threat of nuclear war and the breakdown of traditional structures of meaning. These are some of the issues that Auden is really going to be approaching in this particular poem. Now, the title, "The Shield of Achilles," is actually the title of a larger collection of poetry that includes major poetic sequences, such as the Bucolics and the Horae Canonicae. Many of these are meditations on landscape, right, natural scenes, dealing with the environment. But what we see in the title poem, so the poem within the broader collection that's titled Shield of Achilles, the specific poem that's titled Shield of Achilles, we see it will have a relationship to nature and to the environment, but more specifically is really about man's relationship to violence in many ways. And so we could see it as a bit of a reflection on this ancient Greek notion of the hero. And of course, we've been looking in many of the works of literature over the past videos at many martial heroes more recently. And so it's worth thinking a little bit about how Auden is using this image of the Shield of Achilles to talk about broader concepts of society and warfare and heroism. All right, so a little bit of background. So, who is Achilles? What is the Shield of Achilles? Uh, I can't give you too much background here. There's a lot to take in. The main thing is to know that Homer, the ancient Greek poet Homer, is right, one of the most famous, of course, poets in all of world tradition of poetry. Right, famously wrote the Odyssey, the tale of Odysseus' journey back to Ithaca, and the Iliad, right, the siege of Troy by the ancient Greeks. And this right epic poem has been the source of much inspiration, all the way back to the ancient Romans and Virgil and the Aeneid, to more recently to poets like Auden, right, the Shield of Achilles. So within Book 18 of Homer's Iliad, we get a description of the Shield of Achilles. So Achilles' shield at this point in the story has been lost, taken by Hector, who had killed his Achilles' friend Patroclus, who had been wearing Achilles' armor. And so Achilles gets new armor forged by the god Hephaestus. Hephaestus is the smithing god, right? Famously club-footed, and who forges this incredible field. And what we get in the original poem, right, is what is known as an ekphrasis. So an ekphrasis is basically an extended poetical description or a meditation on a particular scene or thing or object. In this case, it's a shield. So what we get for hundreds of lines is in Homer is a description of what's on the shield. And what's on the shield? Well, we get descriptions of the sky and the constellations, like the sun and the moon. We get the descriptions of a wedding, a law case, but we also get scenes of besieging armies as well. An army being ambushed in battle. We get plowed fields. We get harvest that's being reaped. We get grape pickers in a vineyard. We see cattle. We also see the attacking of lions. Um, uh, we see a sheep farm. We see young men and women dancing, and we see a great stream of water. Right, we see the ocean. So there's a lot of natural scenes, but also scenes of human society. Now, this is going to be juxtaposed against the way Auden is going to approach this. His own poem is itself an ekphrasis in this sense. And again, it's worth keeping in mind that this is within an overall context of um, uh, of other kind of pastoral or natural poetry, right, in the overall collection. Moreover, it's worth keeping in mind at the very outset what the structure of the poem is. So the structure is this. We have the character Thetis, which is a goddess who is the mother of Achilles, right, who is here with the god Hephaestus to get a shield made for her son Achilles. Now, she wants a shield that would look something kind of like we see in Homer, but in this poem, she's going to get something much different. So the first thing to note about the poem, before we get into reading it together here, is the way that it is laid out. So you'll notice that there are a series of stanzas, and that some stanzas have shorter lines and some stanzas have longer lines. The stanzas of shorter lines all start out the same way. She looked over his shoulder. The she is the goddess Thetis, mother of Achilles, right? His shoulder, that is the shoulder of Hephaestus, the smithing god who's forging the shield. And in these shorter stanzas, what we see are really the expectations of the goddess Thetis, of what she wants to see, which is, again, what's on Homer's actual description of the shield in the Iliad. The longer stanzas, though, are what she in fact sees in this poem, which is the modern world's image of these kinds of things. And in other words, it's really, that's where we see Auden's meditation on what's going on here. So keep that in mind, and we are going to read it together and go through these images that are laid out here. So the first stanza starts out like this. She looked over his shoulder for vines and olive trees, marble well-governed cities, and ships upon untamed seas. But there, on the shining metal, his hands had put instead an artificial wilderness, the sky like lead. All right, so we see the poems begin, right? She's looking for Hephaestus' shoulder, Thetis is, right? And she's looking, she wants vines, she wants olive trees. Again, this is what we have in the original description, right? We have people, picking grapes. And so she's looking for that kind of natural image, right? But she's also looking for images of society. So she's looking for marble, right? Beautiful marble cities that are well governed, right? The kind of Greek ideal of the polis, right? The city. And ships upon untamed seas. So there we get kind of two images. We get the image of the sea, the natural image, the sea that is untamed, and especially that would have been the case in ancient Greek context, where right, sailing was a lot more perilous, you could say, but also ships, right? So a man-made device, right? But she looks on that shining metal of the shield, and what he has forged there instead, right? We get the sense of an artificial wilderness. So it's a wilderness, but again, it's an artificial one. And remember, this is where we are getting our first introduction to what Auden's doing here, which is a reflection and a meditation upon the modern world. So this wilderness, it's artificial, and the sky is like lead. Well, maybe it's a lead shield, but we certainly get this image of, right, the natural world, especially in the original shield. In Homer, right, we get this description of, right, the constellations in the sky and all this beauty. Here, the sky is like lead. It's, again, so this kind of, and obviously there's also associations with right, lead being right off in the middle of bullets. So let's think about what that is going to mean as we look at this next stanza. So again, we see we are moving into a longer line, and that's indicative that we're now moving out of looking at what Thetis is hoping to see, and what instead is actually on the shield. So you could see this as kind of the modern, or the longer lines as the modern stanzas. So the first one of these stanzas begins like this. A plain without a feature, bare and brown. No blade of grass, no sign of neighborhood. Nothing to eat and nowhere to sit down. Yet, congregated on its blankness, stood an unintelligible multitude. A million eyes, a million boots in line, without expression, waiting for a sign. All right, so we get this description of a plain, but it's not the kind of plain, the grassy plain where maybe sheep are grazing, as we get in the original Shield description in Homer. Instead, it's without feature. It's bare and it's brown, right? So it's the exact opposite of what you would see in a kind of pastoral, right, natural image, right? So there's explicitly no blade of grass, right? It's stripped of all that kind of beauty and form. But we also get this interesting description. There's no sign of neighborhood. One of the things that a lot of modern poets are responding to in the post-war period is the breakdown of traditional structures of societal interaction, right? As more and more people moved from out of smaller villages and rural contexts into larger cities, and as cities expanded into suburbs, it became more and more common for there not to be a town square, for the neighbors not to know each other, and this started, leading to a lot of listlessness that a lot of poets are responding to. So here we already are getting this sign that what this poem is really about isn't perhaps right Homer, but about the world in which he was right living in the post-war period. So again, nothing to eat and nowhere to sit down. So that's kind of interesting. So we get the sense that, again, the earth is barren. So remember, this is within a larger context. It's talking about nature. So here we get the sense that the land has become barren. It's no longer producing food for people to eat. And even the sense, though, this is interesting, nowhere to sit down. So there's a sense that, right, this land is so bare that you wouldn't even want to sit on it. There's no, grassy hill on which to, right, to sit. And a lot of times in this kind of tradition on which this is commenting, right? This kind of the natural scenes that we see, for instance, on the Shield in Homer, and in many other places, right? You get the sense that the grassy field is a place to kind of sit and play music or ruminate, or maybe in more contemporary poetry, right? Read a book or something like that. But it can't be done here because it's been stripped of that which makes it properly hospitable to people. And yet there is a congregation here, right? There's a bunch of people congregated who are coming together on its blankness, right? Which is interesting. So it's a bunch of people in a blank space, right? And who are they? What's standing there? What is congregating there? Well, it's an unintelligible multitude. So it's a multitude of people, but it's unintelligible. So we get this sense that whatever this multitude is, it's not a kind of united congregation. In other words, or if it is, it's united in a bad way, in an unintelligible way. Anyway, so we get a sense of a million eyes, right? A million boots in line. So that's important. So we get the reference to boots, and we get the reference to standing in line. So what does that make us think of? Well, probably soldiers. Right, boots are often associated with the military, and of course, standing in line is a very military kind of thing to do. Keep in mind, again, this is the post-war period. This is, a society that in many ways is still dealing with the aftershocks of the Second World War, and is also existing in the Cold War as well. So we get a million boots in line. So we can imagine, okay, there's maybe soldiers here. There's a sense of without expression, expressionless. You could perhaps imagine, if you've seen them, the old propaganda videos, often used in documentaries, from National Socialist Germany in the 1930s and 40s, where you get these lineups of Nazi troops, right, without an expression, completely expressionless, like stone. But there's a sense of, why are they standing there? Why are they in line? They're waiting for a sign. Now, keep in mind that the shield itself could be seen as a sign, right? The shield is a signifier, right? It's signifying a bunch of different things about society, maybe about Achilles, in the original poem, right? And it has meaning, right? It's all of the scenes that Homer describes have meaning to both the original audience, but even to readers up until the present. But there's a sense that these soldiers, what they're waiting for, right, being expressionless, and perhaps also the reason for them being an unintelligible multitude is that they're waiting for a sign that they're not going to get. All right, so it continues in the next stanza, which is also long. It's continuing the same scene. Out of the air, a voice without a face, proved by statistics that some cause was just, in tones as dry and level as the place. No one was cheered, and nothing was discussed. Column by column in a cloud of dust, they marched away, enduring a belief whose logic brought them somewhere else, to grief. So we get the sense that they're standing in line, waiting to hear something from perhaps an authority. And there's a sense of out of the air, so probably a loudspeaker, a voice without a face, right? So there's this sense that it's describing, you could say, a literal situation, insofar as if it is a loudspeaker, it would be a voice without a face. But also there's, you can see symbolically, right? The face is, of course, what? It's the human aspect of the person, right? But you take the face away, right? And you get a kind of disembodied voice, a dehumanized voice. And then what's the voice doing? It's proving by statistics that some cause was just, right? So now we get a sense, if these are soldiers, what we're talking about, right, a just cause for war. And there's a sense that it is, the voice is proving it by statistics, but in tones as dry and level as the place. So there's a sense that, right, the tones are dry, level. You can imagine perhaps a kind of monotone. It's as level as the very place itself, which is a level plane but stripped of everything, right? So there's a sense that this isn't the kind of heroic war speech by, right, the general on the horse, but rather it's a kind of technocratic, right, statistician trying to prove through all of these various premises why they ought to go to war. And what does this result in? Well, it means that no one cheers and nothing was discussed. Now, that's kind of interesting. So we get no cheering, so there's no emotional reaction, but we also get a sense that it seems to be stripped even of a kind of logical basis insofar as nothing was discussed. It's not like they sit around and then discuss these statistics. And is this war just? Not quite. Instead, the result is column by column in a cloud of dust. So again, you can imagine soldiers marching in columns, right, kicking up dust around them, right? They march away, enduring a belief. Now, that's really interesting. So we often think of belief, right, as something that right, one has just kind of as a part of them. You don't really necessarily think about enduring it, but by enduring it, he's emphasizing, Auden is the right, the burden, you could perhaps say, of this belief, right? It is a belief whose logic brought them somewhere else to grief, right? So there's a sense that right, they have to endure the belief in this cause being just through this kind of dry statistics, but ultimately this logic will bring them to grief, perhaps to death and war. All right, so now we're going to transition back. We're going to be back to a next stanza is shorter lines, and we're back in the perspective of Thetis for a moment. She, that's her again, looked over his shoulder for ritual pieties, right? One of the things that we, right, see on the shield, for instance, would be something along the lines of, traditional pious actions, for instance, right? So piety is basically duty. So in the ancient Greek world, you would have duty, certain things you ought to do or perform for your city, your polis, for your family, right, your children or your mother and your father, and for the gods, right, for the ritual um, uh, actions of the religion of the city. So then we get this reference to so she looked over his shoulder for ritual pieties, white flower garlanded heifers, libation and sacrifice. But there, on the shining metal, where the altar should have been, she saw by his flickering forge light quite another scene. So we get these heifers, right? So cows, basically, that have white garlands around them. That might seem kind of like a strange image to modern people, but that's typically very similar analogies in many ancient societies. In ancient Greece, right, you would sacrifice heifers to the gods, and you would garland them with flowers before they were slaughtered. And then we get libation. A libation is a pouring out, so you'd usually have a ritual pouring out, perhaps of wine or something like that, in traditional sacrifices, and then we get the actual explicit reference to sacrifice. So that's what she's expecting to see. But there on the shining metal, where the altar should have been, so that, again, the animal will be sacrificed on the altar. Instead, she sees, and there's this image of the flickering forge light. So the light of the forge, the fires in the forge, right? Through this flickering light, she sees something else very, very different. Keep in mind when we look at this next scene that it is existing where the sacrifice should be. Now, if you remember, if you cast your mind back to the very first video on what culture means and where it comes from, cultus, you remember it's where we get the word cult, and not just in the modern sense, but even in the traditional sense of, like a cult of saints or something like that. And so it's related also to worship. So keep in mind that has been stripped out because we're talking about the modern world here, and instead we get something in its place. So what do we get? So the next stanza goes back to longer lines, so we know that we're getting another description of the modern world. Barbed wire enclosed an arbitrary spot, where bored officials lounged, one cracked a joke, and sentries sweated for the day was hot. A crowd of ordinary decent folk watched from without, and neither moved nor spoke, as three pale figures were led forth and bound to three posts driven upright in the ground. So there's no altar at this point in the shield. Instead, what we get are something. It's just an arbitrary spot. So again, the spot devoid of meaning. It's arbitrary and it's enclosed in barbed wire. So we can imagine maybe a concentration camp, maybe a prison camp. Again, these are the images coming out of the Second World War. And what do we have? We have something very after that. In the next line, we have something reminiscent, perhaps, of the scene where we have this faceless voice over a loudspeaker, talking in dry, level tones, spouting out statistics. So the officials are lounging around and they're bored. One's even cracking a joke. Right? And you see the sentries, this image of them sweating for it's a hot day. And we have this interesting note, a crowd of ordinary, decent folk. Right? So we see that whoever is watching about what's about to happen are not characterized as some kind of monstrous multitude, but rather a crowd of just ordinary, decent people. We could perhaps cast our mind back to Moore's line in A Man for All Seasons when he talks about, oh, these ordinary men. So what are these ordinary, decent folk doing? And remember, if this is a comment by Auden on the modern world, he really is trying to kind of implicate everyone in this. He's not singling out any kind of specific identity group, right? He's really talking about just people in general. So these ordinary, decent folk are watching, it says, from without. So there's a sense that maybe they're on the other side of the barbed wire. And neither moved nor spoke. So again, we could also remember the soldiers, standing expressionless. So here they're not described as expressionless necessarily, but they're not moving and they're not speaking. And they're not moving or speaking, but they're watching as three pale figures are led forth and bound. Right? So we have three figures are pale, perhaps through maltreatment, and they're bound. So we know they're some kind of prisoners. And they're bound where? To three posts driven upright in the ground. So there's three posts in the ground and they're tied to them. Now, already at this point, we should be thinking of this looks like an execution. Usually, if you're let out and you're tied to a post, it means you're about to be executed. And this already looks like a prison camp. So, things the scene is being painted for some kind of military or execution or something like that. And then it goes on in the next stanza. Also long-lined, also in the same description, same scene. The mass and majesty of this world, all that carries weight and always weighs the same, lay in the hand of others. They were small and could not hope for help, and no help came. What their foes liked to do was done. Their shame was all the worst could wish. They lost their pride and died as men before their bodies died. So we get this opening line about the mass and majesty of this world, which you could potentially argue is what is in Homer's original description of the shield. Right? It encompasses all the mass and majesty of the world, but all that carries weight and all weighs the same and always weighs the same. So there's a sense that everything that has weight, and you could see maybe weight being associated with meaning, all that has meaning in the world and always has meaning, always weighs the same, that lay in the hands of others. That's to say, for the men who are being tied to the posts, they no longer have agency. It's been stripped from them. It says that they, again, the prisoners were small and could not hope for help, and no help came. Right. So again, we're dealing with a helpless and hopeless scene. What their foes like to do was done. In other words, their foes, the people who captured them and bound them, could do whatever they wanted. And it says their shame was all the worst could wish. So they've not only been about to have their lives taken away, they've also been shamed, right? They've been degraded as human beings. It says they lost their pride, and we see this as kind of a proper pride, not in a pejorative sense. They lost their pride and died as men before their bodies died. So there's a sense that there's more to the kind of human person than simply the body. And so even before their bodies died, they had died as men. They weren't able to actually exercise the proper sense of what they were. And there's a question, too, of what Auden's doing here. Is he simply talking about the results of warfare? Is he simply talking about the kind of camps that were, the sad legacy of the Second World War? Or is he even talking more broadly, Remember who's watching this. The ordinary, decent folk, he says, right? So there's this question of, is he actually commenting on the modern world in general and indicating that, right, many modern people die as people before their bodies die. All right, so now we're going to switch back to Thetis, and this is signaled by the shorter lines and by this refrain. She looked over his shoulder for athletes at their games, men and women in a dance, moving their sweet limbs quick, quick to music. But there on the shining shield his hands had set no dancing floor, but a weed-choked field. So she looks over Hephaestus' shoulder and she wants to see athletes at the games, right? That's a very common scene in Greek art, right? Athletes, right, performing various kinds of athletic feats. And again, men and women in dance, moving their sweet limbs quick, quick to music, right? The lively culture of uh, of right, dance and kind of civic participation, but she doesn't see that, right? Instead, there on the shining shield, right, there's no dancing floor. Instead, there's a weed-choked field. So again, another natural image, but like all the natural images that we're seeing in this poem, right, it's never nice and pastoral, and a happy nature scene is always barren, or in this case, weed-choked. So again, we get the sense that she's not seeing what she wants. So what does she see? Well, we see now that it moves back to longer lines, so we know we have our description, actually the final description of a more modern scene. And this is what Auden describes. A ragged urchin, aimless and alone, loitered about that vacancy. A bird flew up to safety from his well-aimed stone. That girls are raped, that two boys knife a third, were axioms to him, who'd never heard of any world where promises were kept, or one could weep because another wept. So we get this description again, instead of youths dancing and athletes performing, right? We get a ragged urchin, a street urchin, right? A homeless boy. He's aimless, so again, he's purposeless. He has no meaning, and he's alone. We've already seen this lack of neighborhood in one of the earlier stanzas. And what's he doing? He's loitering about. Again, that's what is loitering. It's basically hanging around with no purpose about that vacancy. What's the vacancy? It's the weed-choked field. It's vacant. There's nothing there. It's meaningless. So what does he do in this meaninglessness? Well, violence, which again is one of the meditations of the poem. So a bird, again, another natural image, has to fly up to safety to get out of the way of his well-aimed stone. So he's throwing stones at the bird. And then we see that this next line, that for him, the fact that girls are raped, that two boys knife a third, right, two young boys might set on a third and stab him. These were axioms to him. They were just assumptions. That's just the way the world is. That kind of violence. And it indicates he'd never heard of any world where one kept one's promises, or where one could weep because another wept. In other words, he's never heard of a world of compassion. He's never heard of a world of empathy. This, it seems, Auden is suggesting, is, again, not only a meditation on the modern world, but also he's seeming to place us within the context of it being the engine of violence and strife. But how does this relate back to Achilles? Well, let's look at this final stanza. It goes back to the short lines, and we get the conclusion. Right, the thin-lipped armorer, that's Hephaestus hobbled away. Thetis of the shining breast cried out in dismay at what the god had wrought to please her son. The strong, iron-hearted, man-slaying Achilles, who would not live long. So we get the sense, right, that Hephaestus has forged the shield and then he hobbles away. Thetis of the shining breast, that's a traditional description from Homer. It's a oral poetic description. Right? She cries out in dismay at what he has created, right? At what the god had wrought to please her son. It was meant to please Achilles, right? Shouldn't he have made a shield glorifying all the great deeds of Achilles, right? He was described as strong, iron-hearted. He's utterly lacking in compassion or empathy, or perhaps at least one could make that case. And he's manslaying. He's described always in Homer as being, right, incredibly proficient at slaying other men. But he's also will not live long. So in Homer, Achilles has the option. He can basically either live, die a natural death in old age and achieve no renown, or he can go to Troy and fight with the Greeks and die young. And he makes that decision. He decides to do that. And famously, of course, he is shot in the heel, at his Achilles heel, the one place he's vulnerable, and he dies. So Achilles is about to die in war, that which he is most proficient at. And what will he come to? It seems that perhaps Auden is not only commenting on the modern world, but he's really commenting on the figure of the warrior, but perhaps not even just Achilles, and perhaps not even just the ancient Greek Achilles, but the warrior in general, and perhaps war in general. We see all of these modern images of modern war, right? The soldiers lined up, the execution, but it expands further, right? We also see the sense of the meaningless kind of modern existence of ordinary people. We also see this, again, the violence of just the boy in the street, wandering purposelessly and aimlessly. And so, as we continue our reflections and our discussion of what is a hero in literature and what does heroism mean in literature, and if we think about, again, the heros, right, that ancient Greek word, right, originally just that strong man favored by the gods, right, usually martial, usually warlike. What does it mean? What does it mean in the context of the modern world? Does it have any meaning at all? And for Auden, is he indicating that this right kind of heroism is false? Keep this in mind as we continue our discussions going forward, as we will soon see many more examples of warrior heroes.